Good morning, all, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. If you feel so inclined, introduce yourself in the chat before we get started. Hey, Sarah and Gary and AJ, good morning. We've got folks calling in, fantastic. Awesome. Welcome to the call. For those who've just entered, we're so glad to have you here this morning. We'll get started in just 2 minutes. I am looking out my office window and seeing the leaves change into my favorite season, fall. I'm a walking cliche. Jennifer's here from Mudflat Studios, one of my favorite places on earth. Okay, folks. Those who just joined, we're going to get started in just 1 minute. If you feel so inclined, you can introduce yourself in the chat box before we get started. We've got a fair amount to cover today, and I suspect there will be a number of questions that we're going to try to either answer in real time, or we will take all of the questions that are included in the chat and work on answering them and following up. So don't be shy if you need clarifications. There's a lot going on. Okay, folks, so let's get started. Welcome to MASSCreative's Virtual Policy and Action Update, our bi-weekly 15-minute Zoom where we try to give you all the policy updates that are happening on federal, state, and local level, and then we try to tell you how you can get involved. So without further ado, let's get started. Alrighty, so first big piece of news. So last night, the US House passed the Skinny Heroes Act, which is a $2.2 trillion total package act. You can see from my slide, there is a laundry list of things included, but I do want to just point out a couple of things. So each, both the NEA, the NEH, and IMLS, all three will each receive in this bill $135 million. There's also a $10 billion fund for live independent venue operators. That's both nonprofit, for-profit, and government-owned. Then there is $436 billion for state and local aid. They're also extending that federal pandemic unemployment compensation for both independent contractors and W-2 workers, and there's a provision for mixed earners. So if you get a W-2 and a 1099, there's a provision there for you too. And then way down at the bottom, they would also include an extension of that 50% federal forgiveness for unemployment assistance for nonprofits that self-insure and owe money. So that is a lot, right? And that's $2.2 trillion. I'm gonna just pause and point out that there are provisions in here that will actually really make a difference for the creative community. And the reason they are included is because groups like the National Independent Venue Association, Americans for the Arts, state advocacy organizations like ours, as well as others across the nation, independent creative and venue workers have all stood up and shared what their needs are and what's happening right now with their elected officials. And so this is just a moment to pause and say that advocacy works, right? Like these things wouldn't be in there if we weren't pressing and making sure that they were included. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. There's the House version, which is at 2.2. This White House yesterday released their version, which is at 1.6 trillion. And then the Senate's version, which is at $1 trillion. None of those numbers match, and there is very little likelihood that any of these are going to move forward before November 3rd. So that is frustrating. And is something that we are continuing to look at, but that is the reality. And so this is the piece, right? Like, we need to make sure our voices are heard. We need to make sure we're including our needs and our asks when legislation is being made. And then we need to also, or we're also gonna have to watch how it plays out. The fact that these things are included is encouraging to me to think that after November 3rd, there's the real possibility that some of these things will continue to move forward. All right, so then I'm going to move us on to the state and talk about reopening, which I know many of us have been thinking and looking at this week. So 2 days ago, Baker released his plans for the start of phase 3, step 2 reopening. It's gonna start on Monday. And the way that they're doing this is a little bit different than the way that they've done the other steps. So before it was like, okay, now all of Massachusetts is gonna move forward into this next phase and this next step. But for this one, they are specifically designing it so it's lower risk communities are able to move into step 2. So what makes a lower risk community? It means that you have that city or town has not been classified as a red community for the last 3 weekly DPH reports. And you cease being a lower risk community if for 3 weeks in a row you move back into that red category. So if it's only 1 week or only 2 weeks, you stay as a lower risk community. But if it's 3 in a row, you're considered red and you have to move back into step 1. Okay, so here is a map that shows you what who are the lower risk communities versus the higher risk communities for the week of September 13th through the 26th. You can sort of see right here, right, Western Mass almost is entirely in gray with the exception of North Adams right up here, okay? So this is how they're gonna move forward with the protocols. So the other big thing I just want to remind everyone is that just because you might be considered a community that is lower risk because you're not in the red does not mean that the municipality has to. Maureen, thank you. It's Williamstown, not North Adams. My deep, sincere regrets for that mistake. But thank you, Maureen, for pointing that out for me. So as I was saying, if the municipalities don't feel ready or equipped to move into phase 3, step 2, they do not have to, okay? So Mayor Walsh already announced that the city of Boston will not be moving into phase 3, step 2. They are gonna hold a webinar today at 11 a.m., which I encourage you to check out, where they're gonna explain how they're planning to move forward with reopening. The other thing that I just wanna lift up for us is that just because you can doesn't mean you have to reopen or go to the top of the max capacities that they're offering. It's just, these are sort of the bare minimums that you have to do if you want to do it. Wolf Brown has partnered with a number of groups across the globe to create this audience outlook monitor, and it shares data about audience attitudes about going back into public spaces and their attitudes about the arts in general. And there's some really great data in there. Arts Boston is their partner for the greater Boston area, and a number of different arts and cultural organizations are participating in that study. And there's some really telling information that's coming out of that about whether audiences feel ready to move back into public spaces specifically, and then also specifically arts and cultural venues. So do check that out. So now, without further ado, let's go into some of the details. So we're going to start with theaters, concert halls, and similar performance venues. So step one, there's some updates, right? And I think the big headline for all of this is that staff and performers do not count towards capacity limits anymore. That doesn't mean that staff and performers don't need to be taken care of, that they don't have to follow the workplace protocols which have been released, but that they don't count towards those capacity limits. If we go into step two, they also don't count towards those capacity limits. Outdoor venues can now have a capacity of 50% with a max of 250. And for the first time, they are allowing indoor venues to open with a 50% capacity and a max of 250 people. There's a big note that already a number of folks have flagged for me, which is this issue about they are including guidance that they are discouraging the playing of wind instruments and brass instruments and singing. Singing is not permitted indoors. You can perform indoors with brass and wind instruments if you so choose. There are additional increased social distancing requirements that are listed here. They are discouraging it, but they're not saying you can't do it. So there are more guidelines that we put in the chat box, all of them and all of the checklists, but these are sort of the biggest pieces that are jumping out right now that I wanted to cover for folks. Then let's talk about other arts and cultural venues. So museum capacity is now increased to 50%, and that's for historical sites as well as museums. If you were, that's 50% of capacity. If you were following the square footage rule instead of the capacity, your amount of attendance doesn't change. But if you were going by capacity, you can now go up to 50%. Libraries in step two will be allowed to go to 50%. And then outdoor gatherings, they've changed some of the pieces for public events and event venues. So, excuse me, public spaces and event venues. So now if you're in an event venue or a public space, and you're outdoors, you can have up to 100 people in lower risk communities. That's in step two. But indoor gathering stays at 25 people max for all communities. So what's the difference between the an event venue and a performance venue? Event venues are like rental halls. That's what we're talking about. Performance venues are when you're doing performance. If you're an arts and cultural space that is doing that work, you need to follow those guidelines. We are looking for additional guidance, and we're asking for additional guidance around the question of if a venue is holding a rental event, what does that mean in terms of, say, a venue's holding a wedding or a birthday party? How is that going to impact? Which rules do they need to follow? And we'll follow up with that information. Then, okay, so before, sorry, I jumped ahead. So I just want to take a pause here. We don't always have a lot of time, but Rachel Hart says, are concessions allowed to be served in theaters and live venues in phase 3, step 2? You know, I believe so. Rachel, I will say, they clearly say that movie theaters are allowed to have concessions open in the next phase. So if you are a movie theater, you certainly can. I will make a note and we will get a confirm on whether or not live venues are allowed to do that. Okay, are there other questions? Here's what we're doing. Over here at MASSCreative, we are collecting feedback on these guidelines, not feedback like, I don't think you should do that, but feedback and questions about, I don't understand this, or I need clarity from my venue on this piece of the reopening plan. And we're gonna package that up and we're gonna share it with some of our contacts in the Baker administration to ask for guidance. And then also to, you know, if there are things that we need to sort of nudge them a little bit on, this is the moment. So my email is eruddock@mass-creative.org. If you don't feel comfortable putting your question in the chat, please email me. You are more than welcome to. I'm going to try to package that up by this afternoon or by Monday to get that back to our folks in the Baker administration, not our folks, our contacts in the Baker administration. And I want to make sure that that is representative of the creative sector. That's both if you are a small venue or if you are a massive venue. That is what we're trying to do right now. We want to make sure that they know what the creative sector is thinking and worrying about. So now we're going to move on and talk about money. State budget. So this is the most prolonged state budget of any of our lifetimes, I think. Although if you can flag for me a longer state budget process, please let me know. We expect, so Chair Michaelwitz, who is the Ways and Means Chair for the House, Chair Michaelwitz, who's the Ways and Means Chair on the Senate, Senate President Spilka, have all weighed in this week with comments about the budget process because they're getting asked a ton of questions about it. Here's what we know, that on October 7th, so next Wednesday, the Joint Ways and Means Committee is going to hold a hearing to get updated projections on tax revenues. They did this in April, and if you are so inclined, it's actually really informative. If you have the time and the means to check it out, it'll be live streamed. The link isn't up yet, but they are hearing from the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, the Donahue Center for Public Policy, a number of other think tanks and economists, as well as Secretary Heffernan, and the state treasurer. And they're going to share what the new projections are, as well as what has been the tax revenue that's been collected to date. That will tell us, that'll give us a better sense of what's happening, right? The other thing that's going to happen is on October 15th, it's the deadline for the Baker administration to make adjustments to the annual revenue projections. So once those two things have happened, the legislature can kind of really go in and figure out what they're going to do next. There's a lot of different options that they have, right? So we know that the 3-month spending plan that started in August will end officially on October 31st. And so they have to come up with something by October 31st, but they could do a couple of things. They could do a 1-month extension. They could do a 3-month extension. They could do a 6-month extension. They could say, we're going to do the whole thing. They could also choose to do what's called sort of a pre-conference bill. And that means that the House and the Senate kind of get together and work on it before they release it to the full bodies. And it's sort of like, look, this is kind of a done deal. We're going to debate it, but we're not going to go through the traditional process that you and I know, which is when the House puts out their version, amendments happen, they pass it, it moves to the Senate puts out their version, they do the amendments, it happens. They conference the two bills, reconcile it, vote on it, and send it to the governor. They may sort of truncate that by doing what's called a pre-conference version, where they are, they're sort of saying like, this is what we're gonna do, and we want your approval, and then we're gonna move it really quickly to the governor. That could happen too. It's a little bit, we're in uncharted territory, right? But we are working really hard and we're paying attention, and when the opportunity comes for us all to advocate and ensure that ensure that when it is time and appropriate, we are making sure that our elected officials are making sure that the Mass Cultural Council budget is funded at the appropriate and necessary levels for our sector, right? I think it's also important to just clock here that one of the things they may do is they may just do sort of across the board cuts, and which means that every single budget line is going to go down in an equal amount because they just don't have the money. So things are still up in the air, but this is my newest update. So we are at time, but if you can hang on, I've got a couple more things I want to talk about. Create the vote. So 2 weeks ago, a judge struck down the Trump administration's plan to cease all census data collection efforts on September 30th. They said that that was not allowed and that they had to extend it through October 31st. And then the Trump administration sued to get it to end sooner. So technically, census collection is still supposed to be happening. And our allies in this work, who are census advocates and voting advocates, are using Monday, October 5th as their sort of informal end of the census. But there's a chance it could continue. So if you have not filled out the census, what's happening? Why are you waiting? It is legal, it is safe, your data will not be shared. It'll be basically in a lockbox for like 75 years. It's so important, and you should not delay in filling out that census. If you have networks and friends that have not done it, this is the time, this is the final push. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly is right now is the time where you should be making your plan, your voting plan for November 3rd. This year, there's a lot of different things that are happening and a lot of different changes, so it can feel very overwhelming. So now's the time to sit down and think, how do I want to vote? Do I want to vote? Do I want to vote by mail-in ballot? request your mail-in ballot. Do I want to choose early voting? Check out and know where you will, where you can go to do that early voting. Are you going to vote on November 3rd? Know where that is. Ruth, you are saying, would you advise voting in person? Emily Ruddick, a personal citizen and registered voter of Massachusetts, would not advise in-person voting because it's just not as safe as that mail-in vote, right? Like COVID has not changed dramatically. Our behaviors has changed, and that's what has kept the cases down. So as much as possible, if there are ways to not be in contact with folks, that is great. There is, you'll see on this little graphic that I have here, you can check the status of your mail-in ballot, right? So if you are worried that it has not reached its destination, you can see that. I know a couple of folks did a mail-in ballot for the primary and they were able to check it in real time. There will also be ballot drop boxes. So if you don't feel safe or confident in the U.S. Postal Service at the moment, you can drop it off at your polling location or drop it off at one of those drop boxes. Here's a fun fact. The city of Boston and all of the Boston libraries have now become ballot drop-off locations. Yay, libraries. So if you don't feel like you can make it all the way down to City Hall, you can drop it off at your library once that is available, okay? Yay, library, says Eva. So the other piece of this is it's not just enough to make sure that you've made your voting plan. This year, we need to make sure that other people are making their voting plan. And we have been partnering with the Safe Elections Network this year, and they have a number of really phenomenal resources and ways that you can volunteer and engage. You can volunteer to phone bank to encourage people to make their voting plans. You can volunteer to monitor social media because we know there's a lot of disinformation going on right now. So you can take you can volunteer to learn how to do that. You can volunteer to be a poll monitor. That is not a poll watcher. That is a trained poll monitor who is making sure that there isn't voter intimidation, and you actually have to go through a training to do that. Those are all volunteer opportunities that you can take advantage of and share with your networks. So there's some question in the chat box, have folks received their mail-in ballot yet? I believe they started getting mailed, but it might be a little slower right now. So we will keep tracking that as it goes. But if you haven't received your ballot yet, or if you're worried that you requested your ballot or you don't know if you have, you can go and you can request your ballot again online. This year for this general, they've made it so that you can request it online as opposed to having to fill out the form and mail it into your local polling office. You can just do it right there online. Okay. So we are 4 minutes over, and I'm so thankful for those of you who were able to stick with us to talk about these important voting voting and census issues. So a reminder, we will be back again on Friday, October 16th. If between now and Friday, October 16th, you have a pressing or burning question, G and I are here. G is on the line right now. He's the one who's been populating the chat box for us. And we are always happy to try and answer your question or to do any sort of like connection or navigation that you are looking to do in terms of increasing your advocacy efforts or understanding these new guidelines and provisions. So thank you all. I hope you have very good weekends. I hope you get outside. The Ruddick Lilienthal household will be going apple picking this weekend. So please enjoy your first sort of official weekend of fall. All right. See you next time.